Welcome to my analysis of the distribution of the solar return ascendant for America this year through the sign of Cancer, the Cancer distribution. Now, in this video, I'm going to discuss mainly the distribution of the ascendant through Cancer. I will not address the entirety of the solar return figure for 2017. I shall do that in another video. And I should emphasize that we're not dealing with a transit of any sort. Instead, we're dealing with a primary direction. Okay, this is not a transit of anything in space. The ascendant of this figure is being advanced using primary directions through the various terms. That's what these boxes are. The terms are 5 unequal divisions in every sign, and they are ruled by a planet. So when the ascendant is advancing via primary directions through the terms, then what we have is a Time Lord system. So what that means is that each one of these planetary rulers becomes a Time Lord for the duration of the ascendant's advancement through that term. Okay, and I've been wanting to post on this forever because I've been expecting a huge, terrible Las Vegas style event for many months now, all because of the characteristics of this Saturn and the 2017 solar return for this country. And so now I've determined to pick up, to begin discussing these distributions as they happen, and in fact in advance of them happening. Now, one important feature of the distributions is that there are 2 Time Lords that pair up. First is the distributor, the term ruler, the planet that rules the term that the ascendant is being directed through. And then the other Time Lord is what we call the participator, and that's the planet that casts an aspect ray to the degree that the ascendant is at. So I've marked out Saturn and his aspect rays. Here's his sextile, his square, his trine, his opposition right here in Gemini. In Leo, there's his trine ray, and also his square and his incoming sextile, and then finally the conjunction, the body of Saturn itself. All of these dates are marked out in red, by the way. And so when the ascendant encounters the aspect ray or the body of some planet, then that planet becomes the participator, a secondary Time Lord as well. And it is the interaction between the distributor, the term ruler, and the participator that yields the events. Now, in these chronocrater systems, the planets produce events that conform to their meanings, that conform to their house meanings and their universal meanings as well. They produce events and people, etc., in conformity with these things. So you understand that we're not talking about planets transiting in space, although the transits do fit into this framework of directions very beautifully. But you understand we're not talking about transits. You understand that we're talking about primary directions through the terms, and that the term rulers are Time Lords for short durations of time. And you understand that the aspect rays from all of the other planets also act as subordinate Time Lords, and these Time Lords, they function synergistically with one another. I also would like to point out these stars and these triangles. Just a few bells and whistles of this chart. The red star denotes the sign of the profection, which is Capricorn. America's having a second house year, a Capricorn year, and so this makes Saturn the Lord of the year, and his aspects are going to be way more important than others. So let's begin. Now, also, as you can see, the dates in black show when the ascendant will be directed through these signs, and these periods of time are going to be extremely intense. Note that the Cancer distribution is one such area of the chart, because these signs that have blue stars on them are angles to the profected ascendant of the year. They're angles. They exist at an angle to Capricorn. So Aries, Libra, and Cancer are in the cardinal cross, and therefore, because they are angles of the sign of the perfection, Cancer being the 7th angle from the 7th house from Capricorn, then when the ascendant is directed through these signs, the nightly news in America is going to become much more intense. And for this reason, I've been expecting terrible things for the Cancer distribution. The Cancer distribution, incidentally, is paradigmatic for the rest of the distributions. It sets the tone for the rest. Now, Let us begin. We see that the pertinent period is September the 3rd through October the 9th. So tomorrow, the Leo distribution begins and the Cancer distribution ends. And you'll see that the news is going to become a lot less morbid. Sure, there will be a lot of follow-up based upon the Las Vegas event, but hopefully we'll get a break from actually experiencing much trauma during the Leo distribution. But September 3rd, the ascendant enters into the term of Mars, Cancer, right? At the time, the opposition ray of Saturn is the participator. That opposition ray happened on August the 27th, which incidentally, that night, August 27th, was the MTV Music Awards, and the winner for those awards was a rapper. What was his name? Kendrick Lamar. That's him. He won something like 6 awards. That's definitely due to Saturn representing, sorry about that, representing African Americans generally, people of African descent, and also being in the 9th house. So that's a match for Mr. Lamar winning all those awards. The retrograde nature of the Saturn is what's responsible for the multiplicity of the awards, the fact that there was more than one of them, more than one award. Okay, but my point is that this opposition ray of Saturn remained a Time Lord from August the 27th until September the 19th. Right? So that when the distributor switched from Mars Gemini to Saturn Gemini, the participator is still the opposition ray of Saturn. When the distributor switches from Saturn to Mars, the participator is still the opposition ray of Saturn. And it remain when the distributor becomes Venus Cancer, the participator is still the opposition of Saturn, all the way up until the 19th, when the participator changed over to the body of the sun. Okay, so let's go back to September the 3rd. The Cancer distribution begins in earnest. What happens? What are some news events during the Mars Cancer distribution? Well, on the 4th, Governor Rick Scott declared a state of emergency for Florida as Hurricane Irma approached from the Atlantic. On the 5th, the Trump administration announced that the DACA immigration policy would be totally jettisoned, would be scrapped, an attack on DACA. That matches the participator Saturn being in the 9th house of the courts, being in the 9th house of immigrants and immigration and things like that. Now, on September the 10th, still in Mars Cancer, September the 10th is when a big power outage happened in Florida due to Hurricane Irma. Millions of people left without power. Now, Venus becomes the Time Lord. On the 11th, the directed ascendant enters into the term of Venus, right? And looking at Venus in the return, she is peregrine in Gemini, 12 signs away from Cancer. And all of that will have a specific meaning that we'll get into in a separate video that deals specifically with the solar return as a whole. But just know that that as a term ruler in Cancer, her period was from September the 11th until the 18th. So what happened then? Now, mind you, the opposition ray of Saturn is still the participator. So the pertinent Time Lords are Venus, Saturn, right? On September the 12th, Hillary Clinton released her memoir, What Happened? Right? Her very aptly titled memoir, What Happened, which described her experience as the Democratic Party's nominee for President of the United States in the 2016 election. Right? On the 13th, there was a school shooting in Spokane, Washington. Right? That's what really got me thinking, oh my goodness, something terrible is going to happen here. That's what really, I was like, oh my gosh, it's finally beginning. Here it goes. It's starting now. That happened with the Spokane school shooting in Washington. 3 days later, still during Venus Cancer, Venus is the distributor. The opposition ray of Saturn is still the participator, right? All the way up until here. On September the 16th, Scout Schultz committed suicide by cop. That's definitely a match for Saturn in the 9th. Because first of all, it happened on the campus of a university in Georgia, so that's a match for the 9th house. The bullets and the projectiles is a match for Sagittarius. Death and cops, that's a match for Saturn. Death generally. Also, the next day, On the 17th, we're still in the term of Venus Cancer. 4 American college students were attacked with acid in France. That's definitely a match for the participator, being in the ninth house of overseas places. On the 11th, Mercury becomes the term ruler. The chronocrator, as the directed ascendant, enters into the term of Mercury. And on the 18th, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy during the distribution of Mercury Cancer. Mercury remained a term lord until the 25th of September, by the way. The opposition of Saturn is still was still the participator. And so that's a match for adjudicating bankruptcy through the courts. Now, the next day, on the let's say on the 19th, right? The next day after the Toys R Us filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, on the 19th, President Trump made his first appearance at the United Nations. And the participator changes over from the opposition ray of Saturn to the body of the sun. So that's a match for the president making a speech or an appearance before the United Nations. The United Nations is actually a match for Cancer, if you ask me. So that's all very cogent. But during this address to the United Nations, President Trump claims that he might, quote, have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. The Mercury distribution is also a match for North Korea. In prior distributions through Mercury terms, there has been a lot of controversy with North Korea, them misbehaving and firing missiles and things like that. On the 19th of September, there was this father who got a visitor's badge from the front desk of his daughter's high school and then proceeded to help his daughter beat her ex-boyfriend into critical condition. That's a match for the sun. The sun is fathers. The sun is conjunct Mars. So that's the 19th of September. So as you can see, this entire Cancer distribution has been incredibly lethal and violent, right? Now, on the 20th, we're still in the distribution of Mercury, but the participator changes over from the body of the sun to the Dexter square of Jupiter, right? So Jupiter is casting a square into the term of Mercury, right? And therefore, the Dexter square of Jupiter becomes a participator. And so on that day, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico on September the 20th, the very day of the changeover of the participator. Also, on September the 20th, this kid in Illinois opened fire in his cafeteria. And a few days later, on September the 24th, there was the deadly Tennessee church shooting executed by a Sudanese immigrant. Okay. Now, on the 25th of September, the directed ascendant entered into the term of Jupiter, and then all heck broke loose. Jupiter is very, very violent in this solar return chart due to his position in the 7th house. Right? This is what makes Jupiter so difficult. And when Jupiter along with Saturn sort of times out the various protests that we've had in this nation, and while Saturn pertains mainly to protests that are in a college environment, Jupiter deals with the more violent right-wing protests. So the Charlottesville Unite the Right event happened during the distribution of Jupiter Gemini. So Jupiter is a big deal in this chart, and he's quite violent. So when we entered into the term of Jupiter Cancer on the 25th, I knew something terrible was going to happen, because during that time, the participator would switch over to the body of Mars. So on the 25th, the directed ascendant enters the term of Jupiter Cancer, and Jupiter becomes a time lord. And on the 27th, 2 days later, some kid in the Bronx stabs his high school classmate to death in class or in school. And then a few days later, on October the 1st, of course, was the Las Vegas Massacre itself. Okay, so that was promised by the distribution through Cancer, by the placement of Mars as a participator, and by Jupiter as a term ruler during the Cancer distribution. So we are now in the Saturn term, and when Saturn is an important time lord in this solar return distribution through the signs, then what we usually have, Russia stuff, transcript releases or something comes out that shows that Russia is really a terrible, terrible entity and that they meddled in our election. Something about Russia comes out, or we take some action with Russia, such as closing consulates and things like that. All of that having to do with the ninth house nature of Saturn. Also, a lot of important resignations and firings when Saturn is a ruler of the time in the solar return. Protests and injuries, usually in an academic environment, as opposed to the more ideological protests and more violent protests that are signified by Jupiter. Also, when Saturn has been a Time Lord, there have been Trump orders that are controversial, such as when he beefed up police with military gear. Also, North Korea firing missiles, along with big talk from Trump. That's been a big feature of the Saturn distributions. Dam overflows due to Hurricane Harvey. Trump attacks on the legacies of former President Barack Obama in the guise of wanting to scrap DACA, in the guise of wanting to repeal Obamacare, failed gambits to repeal Obamacare during periods of time that Saturn ruled. So he stands for that. And if we look through the current events that have been happening in America during the Saturn distribution, which lasts from October the 4th to October the 9th, then we see a lot of Saturnian figures step to the front. Harvey Weinstein was in the news, and a very influential entertainment industry czar. Harvey Weinstein got in trouble for paying off, or it came out that he paid off a bunch of victims of his sexual assaults and sexual harassments. He's a match for Saturn because of his Jewishness. Saturn represents the Jewish faith and people who come from Jewish backgrounds, just as Saturn represents people of African descent and people who come from ancient cultures. So that was a match. In terms of Saturn equating to rivalries that Trump has. Here I'm reading in the news, Trump's tweet storm against Corker, who apparently is a senator, Senator Bob Corker, may cost him blah, blah. So Trump's at it again, fighting with senators. Also, Trump says he directed Pence to walk out of the 49ers game during the protest in the national anthem. That's a match for the sporting meanings of Sagittarius, and Vice President Pence is a match for Saturn. White nationalists say they're going to white nationalists reappear in Charlottesville. That's certainly a match for Saturn. And then more developments with North Korea. Kim Jong-un promoted his sister to an important position in his program over there. And of course, Trump had some big words. Storms. Hurricane Nate battering Mississippi and Alabama. That's definitely a match for Saturn, and also for Mercury, which is the current participator right now. All right. Iran warns the United States against imposing further sanctions. That's definitely a match for the overseas nature of the ninth house, the legal nature of the ninth house, and Saturn is certainly warning. Saturn is certainly the Iranian government. Okay, also a gas station explosion in Ghana, the ninth house, again, the foreign nature of this explosion. Cancer is definitely a match for exploding gases, things like that, right? In other news, there was this one guy who, it just came out that he had the bodies of his wife and son in his house for like a year. That's definitely a match for Saturn right there. So the news, the current events in the news are redolent with the meaning of Saturn Cancer. Stay tuned for my next installment when I go through the distributions of the terms in Leo. I'll get those to you in advance so that we can speculate about what will happen before it actually happens. Thank you for watching.